startups to fund. There must be research projects to try. There must be graduate students who work on approaches. Here at MIT, there are people who are looking at learning from the standpoint of looking at child learning, right? How do children learn starting at and work is fantastic. Approaches are different from the approach that most people are taking. Perhaps that's a bad issue, or perhaps it's another one. But at the end of the day, successful entrepreneurs are not as crazy as they sound. They see an opportunity based on what happens with consumerism. As Travis tells the story, he and his co-founder were sitting in Paris, and they had this idea. They said, we have smartphones, and the rest is history. What's the equivalent of that Travis Eiffel Tower, where is a California, that you could, as an entrepreneur, take advantage of, whether it's in or something else? That's the next great story.
And the psychology of that moment. So when Sergey and Larry talk about listen to the interview, very nonchalant. Here's very fascinating bug data, and here's an algorithm we have for, we kind of want to play around with that data, and it seems that that's a really nice way to organize the data. And
well, I just say, I remember is they were graduate students. They thought that and they had to get power from next door because they were using power in the room, so they ran a cord over. Okay.
Yeah.
And then they went and they found a house and they had world headquarters of 5 people, right, to start the company, and they raised $100,000 from Andy Rothschild, founder, to do this, and they charged to others. The point is, beginnings were very simple, based on a powerful. That is a replicable model for any startup. Powerful insight, in Sergey's case, it was E-Track, which was a brilliant idea, one of the most cited papers in the world today. What's the next one?
So you're one of, I may say, richest people in the world, and yet it's the money side of your passion, not an inherent goal. But you're a fascinating person to ask. So much of our society at the individual level and at the company level and the nation is driven by the desire for wealth. What do you think about this drive, and what have you learned about, romanticize the notion of life being achieved on so many dimensions?
There have been many studies of human happiness, and above some threshold, which is typically relatively low for conversation, there's no difference in happiness. The happiness is correlated with meaning and purpose, with family. So if you organize your life, you have enough to get around and a nice support, far happier to figure out what you care about and work on that. It's often being in service to others. A great deal of evidence that people are happiest when they're serving others. It goes directly against sort of press-induced excitement about powerful, wealthy, and indeed you're consequential. But if you are in a situation where you've been very fortunate to not have, you also have to have the responsibility, and you have to work, educate, given that opportunity, but also well to advance society. In my case, I'm particularly using the tools of artificial learning to make society better. I mentioned education, I mentioned quality, with this, all of which are a passion of mine. It doesn't matter what you do. It matters that you believe in it, that it's important to you, and that life will be far more satisfying.
No better than a discussion.
Thank you very much.
Bill Russell, professor of science at Berkeley, co-author of a book that explains the amazing world of AI, artificial intelligence approach. So it was an honor for me to have this conversation as part of MIT course on artificial general intelligence and artificial intelligence podcast. If you enjoy it, please subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, podcast player, or connect with me on Twitter at Lex. Now, here's my conversation with Russell. So you mentioned 1975 is one that chess. Were you ever build a program to chess or another?
So my program never beat chess. I actually wrote the program at Imperial College, so I plus Wednesday with a box of cards and shoved them into the card reader, and they gave us 8 seconds of time. It took about 5 seconds to put cards in and pile 8 seconds of time, which was enough to make one move operating image. And then we would print that move out and put it back and treat the cards in.
As opposed to what I was talking
No, I think we got an 8 move, 8 step 8 alpha, and tricks of our own about ordering tree.
but you were still able to do that program?
Yeah, I was a bullshit. Did an Othello program, backgammon program. When I got to Berkeley, I wrote a book on meta reasoning, which means reasoning about reasoning. In the case of gameplay program, to reason about what parts of the search tree to explore, because the search tree is always bigger than the number of person. And the way program way you by only looking at a small fraction of the search tree. If you look at the right fraction, well, fraction. Take the time thinking about things that are never going to happen, and well, figure out right. That question, how teams can manage their own computation, how they decide what to think about. Meta reasoning question is developed the method of doing that, and very simply, teams should think about whatever thought through this decision point. We're able to show that for Othello, which is a standard play game, and backgammon, which is dice roll, which is play a game. Both of those cases, we come up with algorithms that were actually much more efficient than standard alpha chess programs. And that those programs, I think you can see the same basic idea in AlphaGo and AlphaGo today. The way they explore the tree using form of meta reasoning, like what to think about on how to.
Are there any insights you can describe without Greek symbols of how do we select which path to go down?
There's really two kinds of learning going on. As you say, AlphaGo learns to evaluate, so it comes with a Go board. It actually has probably a superhuman to tell how perfect the situation is. To me, the amazing thing about AlphaGo is not that it can be the world champion. Fact, but the fact that if you stop it from searching together, okay, you're not allowed to do anything ahead. You consider each of your leads and then look at the resulting situation, what we call a step for one immediate outcome. That version of alpha can still still play at a professional level. And human professionals think they have high tech. But AlphaGo can instantly what is the that is because you don't have that AlphaGo would actually think about the situation. But anyway, that capability that AlphaGo has is one part of why the other big part is it's able to get 40, 50, 60 features. And if it was considering all possible features, that would be 100 possible. Way more than so it's very, very selective. I'll try to give you an intuition about how you decide a combination of two things. One is how firms. So if you're already convinced that there's no point spending a lot more time because horribly not convinced. Real reason because of some mind about what and that changing your mind that result in better final action in the world. That's the purpose of thinking. Improve the final action. And so if you think about a move that's guaranteed terrible, it just offers terrible, you're not going to change your mind. But on the other hand, suppose you had a choice between one of them you've already figured out guaranteed and the other one a little bit looks fairly likely to be down. But there's some uncertainty about the value of that move. So some possibility will turn out to win. Then it's worth thinking about that. Even though it's less promising on average than the other move, which is getting draw, there's still some purpose to think about it. Chance to change your mind and discover that it's so it's a combination of how good the move is and how much about it. More uncertainty, more it's worth the higher upside.
Beginning AlphaGo formulation, everything shrouded in uncertainty. Really actually in process describe about everything. Basically a lot of different directions.
Yeah. So fairly cheap. A lot of different possibilities, but fairly degree of some of them we have pretty quickly find out right. Okay. And so further down, we very long and narrow. And following various lines of play, and that's again is something that humans have a very hard time. Mainly, it just lack. Just can't remember. Well, you can't imagine what correctly. That would be the future.
Of course, the top players, I'm much more chess, but the top players probably have echoes of the same kind of intuition at moment's time. AlphaGo applies pattern, games pattern at the grandmaster level. Some clarity, or maybe it's imagination of those similarities. It feels like kind of pattern recognition that the AlphaGo approaches going to level.
There's some truth to mean, I think the extent to which human grandmaster can reliably recognize the right move and recognize the position, I think that's a bit overrated.
Sacrifice it. I mean, people get chess while these things where aiming bad move, and I'm not sure there's a perfect degree of calculation or calculated all the. There's an instant how it adds up.
Yeah, I think what happens is you get a sense that possibility that lines calculation otherwise, and that intuition that some intuition that might win,
On the
and then follow that. And in some sense, when a chess player is following a line in her mind, they're mentally simulating what the other person, the opponent, do, and they can do that as long as kind of force, right? As long as or force issue where the opponent doesn't really have much choice how to respond. You know, we see plenty of like in grandma where they some 4-5 combination. It wasn't particularly apparent position
thing that human. So when you mentioned that in the fellow, after some matter movement research, be how did that make you feel?
part of the meta reasoning capability had based on learning. And now the next day, just got a lot smarter. You know, and all of a sudden, pressed against the wall because much more aggressive. Kind of like actually seemed to understand than I did. Gary Kasparov has this where during his match against that he suddenly felt kind of
I think that's a scary or an exciting. Kasparov and in the context of chess, purely sort of like that feeling, whatever that.
I think it's definitely you know work on AI. First, I really understood what they wanted. Started out with the first program I wrote was and I think you could 21-step algorithm is programmed, right? That and general arithmetic calculations got implemented every. But then you know I thought, okay, I just had this. I could make this, and so I started thinking about AI. I think the thing that's scary not the chess program because chess programs are not taking over the world. But if you extrapolate, you know, there are things about chess that resemble, right? You know, the rules of chess, the chessboard is a program where, of course, the world is not supposed to be not necessarily. And to overcome those kinds of problems, qualitative algorithm. The thing about the real world is that we regularly plan ahead really depth. We don't plan those details, but to Berkeley, that's a 5 amounts to about a control will eventually be
including going upstairs, opening doors, drinking water.
I mean, every well, you capture them, but you're not committing advanced coding, but you're still reasoning on a time scale that will eventually produce trillion coding control actions. And so all these AlphaGo ones and they but they are a step towards progress in AI goes by essentially moving one by one function that problem equation. Move that assumption, you need a much more complicated computing design and something that actually keeps track of all constants and tries to on. It becomes a much more complex problem. But we are moving assumptions, starting to cope along the time scale, cope with each of those steps magnifies by 1,000.
Yeah, I started in AI. I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I wanted to keep the mind and program and so on. And I showed up in Illinois, in the AI lab, and they said, okay, I don't have time for you. AI modern approach, first edition at the time. Here, go learn this. And I remember the land was, well, it's incredibly solve chess, but we'll never solve Go. And it was pretty certain that Go, in the way we thought about solve and now solve this. That's a very
well, I think I would have said that it's unlikely the kind of algorithm test and just get to scale up and go. And at the time, what was that in order to solve Go, you have to do something human management like Go, which is break it down. Things about a Go board, they think about parts of the board as we connect. Think about, okay, within this part of the board, how things go. That part of the board is how things go. Then you try to sort of couple the analysis together and revise your view of how things go in each part. You've got to make 5 and parts of the board. And that actually resembles real world much more than it does. Real world, we have work, home life, sport, whatever, different kinds of activities, shopping, all are connected to each other, but they're deeply connected. When I'm writing a paper, I don't simultaneously have to decide which order I'm going to get the button. That doesn't affect typing. But I do need to realize, okay, I better finish this before the shop's closed because I don't have any around the right? So there's some reconnection, but not in the way that chess works, where everything is tied into. The thought was that Go, to solve Go, would have to make progress on. In a way, AlphaGo is a little bit disappointing, right? Because program design for AlphaGo is not that from Deep Blue or even from Arthur Samuel's checker playing program. And in fact, the two things that make AlphaGo work, one is its amazing evaluation. The other is the meta, which allows it for some tree very deeply and abandon other. very quickly.
Words, better reasoning, well, technically correct, requires perhaps the wrong degree of power that AlphaGo has. Word is a powerful word. Let me ask you, sort of, you were part of like AI world while like, AI was a lot of excellent, interesting ideas there that unfortunately got winter.
So I would say it's not quite as simple. But the AI winter was the first winter that was actually named as one, and that came about because in the mid 80s there was really a concerted attempt to push AI out into using expert technologies. And for the most part, that technology was prime time. Trying, in many cases, of uncertain reasoning, judgment, combination of evidence, which was simply valid. Right, invalid problem. You can budget the full versions of the problem, but it's larger. Many companies found that work and tons of money on try to make it work. And there were, other practical things. They were asking companies to buy incredibly expensive machine workstations, literally $100,000. In 1980s money, which was like $300,000 per workstation, current prices.
So, and the bottom line, they weren't.
Yeah. Many cases, I think there was some success out of it, but people, I would say, overinvest. Every major company starting an AI department just like now. And I worry a bit that we might see similar disappointment. Not because the current technology is valid, but it's limited scope. Almost the dual problems experts have had.
So what have you learned from that hype cycle? What can we do to prevent another winter?
Yeah, so when I'm giving talks days, that's one of the warnings I give. Two-part warning slide. One is that rather than data being well, data is well. And then and the other that you might very visible failing in the application area of driving car, the flagship. And I think look at the history. The first self-driving car was on the freeway, driving itself, changing in 1987, and more than 30 years, like where we are today, right? Prototypes on the freeway. Now, I think significant progress made in the field. A lot on autonomous vehicles in early mid-90s Berkeley. And we had our own demonstration. Self-driving cars and the problem was cleanly perception.
Every time, probably.
So simulation, perfect perception, show that time. But simultaneously, we worked on machine vision for detecting cars and tracking street, and couldn't get the reliability.
good enough to cover the trail.
Yeah, driving. Suppose you're a taxi driver and you drive every 100. Any one of those seconds. So you're talking about nines of reliability. Now, if the vision system only detects, right, that's sort of, one of the big nines of reliability. So you have another go. Um, and this is what people don't understand. They think, oh, because I had a demo, I'm pretty much done. But you're not even in 7 orders of, and that difficult. It's not that can I follow a white line problem, follow a white line all the way through the country, but it's the stuff that other drivers do different things. So if you talk to people, right, so we had actually a very architecture machine vision, which was the cars and pedestrians, white line, road signs, basically get it and had a classic 1970s school, but telling you, okay, if you're in the middle lane and there's a bicycle, and who is signaling it, then right? What they found was that every day they'd go out, the situation cover the traffic circle, and there's a little girl riding a bicycle the wrong way around the traffic. We don't have a rule. Oh my God. Okay, stop. And then back and add more rules. Found that oh, and if you think about it, right, how do you deal with an unexpected situation, one that's never previously encountered? Sort of the reasoning required to figure out the solution for that solution has never been done. It doesn't match any previous solution. Kind of reason. Well, chess programs has happened sometimes. They're constantly coming up with solutions for having what you have to read about them. You have to think about what are the possible things they could do, the outcomes, is how desirable the outcomes are, and then pick the right one. In the 90s, we were saying this is how you're going to have to really have to have it. But the look ahead for driving is more difficult than it is for chess. Right, the humans, if they're less predictable, then you have an opponent in chess, so somewhat unpredictable. But for example, chess, you always know the opponent's intention, right? Whereas driving, you don't know is the guy going to the left, or is he got off his turn signal, front, or changing the channel of his radio, or whatever it might be. You've got to try and figure out the intent of the other drivers, forecast possible edge trajectories, and you've got to figure out which is the trajectory. And those all interact with each other. The other drivers are going to react to your trajectory, and so on. So you've got the classic merging onto the freeway problems where kind of racing a vehicle already on the freeway, pull ahead of them, or you let them go behind it, the guns that going first. So all those kinds of things mean that decision-making architecture is very different from either a rule-based system or as AlphaGo is pretty good when it doesn't way better when it does. I think driving can have a driving doesn't but that's good enough. Already seen by design machine learning out.
Yeah, on several levels, I think perception side, there's mistakes being made by those out, by the shallow planning side, like you said. And the thing that I'm up against that's really interesting to try to deploy in the real world is you can't think of an artificial intelligence system that responds to the world always. You have to realize that agents and others will respond to it as well. So in order to drive success, you can't just try to do the opposite.
Right. You can't pretend that you're in this right, you're the invisible God.
Right. I mean, but you have to get other stuff to do. We're also attention. There's this game. So study a lot of work with pedestrians. If you approach pedestrians as purely an obstacle, what look ahead is the model and the intent. They're not going to. They're going to take advantage of you. They're not going to respect you at all. There has to be attention, a fear, some amount of uncertainty. We have created.
Or at least it's kind of a resolution.
Right, yes,
you have to display a certain amount of resolution. And so the solutions then become pretty complicated. But you can else. So at Berkeley now we're working a lot on kind of interaction.
Right.
And so my colleague, the Dragan, actually, if you formulate a problem theoretically, you're out. It does interesting, unexpected things. Like sometimes at a stop sign, no one is going first, right? The car will actually happen, right? Indicate the other cars you should go. And that's something it invented by itself. It didn't say the language of communication that stop signs. Yeah.
So let me just step back. Beautiful notion. So Pamela Porter wrote, AI began with the answer which was God. Think about the history of our civilization. I think there's an inherent desire to create, not say gods, to create super intelligence. Is it inherent to us? Is it in our gene? The natural arc of civilization is to create greater and greater power, perhaps echoes of ourselves. The gods,
Maybe. I mean, we're all individuals, but certainly over and over again, individuals thought about.
hopefully I'm not being here. If you look at the arc of where this is going, we'll talk about AI, talk about greater and greater intelligence. See that they're when you created the intelligence, what was that? The excitement of a tinkerer creating cool clock? Or was there a magic, or was it more like a child being?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly understand that. But if you look at the Lighthhill report, which was so in the 70s, there was a lot of controversy about AI and whether it was real and government best. It was a long story, but the government issued a report by Lighthhill. It was a he wrote a very damning report on AI. And he said that these are frustrated men who, unable to have children, would like to create a life, which I think is really pretty unfair. there is, I mean, there is a kind of magic. I would feel something, and what you're building in is just building in understanding the principles of learning and decision making, and to see those principles actually then turn into intelligent behavior in situations. It's an incredible thing, and that naturally going to make you okay. Wait a second.
And the magical, optimistic use of word, whatever your view of is probably different for everyone. But you often talk about turns you have often go wrong. So to Max Tegmark, a lot of interesting ways to think about AI. You're one of the seminal people thinking about this problem amongst sort of being in the weeds of actually solving big AI problems. You also think about the big picture of where we're going. Can you talk about several elements about maybe the control problem? So this idea of ability to control AI. How do you do that? How do you to manage it?
Well, so it doesn't take a genius to realize that if you make something fun to do, but Turing wrote about this, lectures about this. One did a lecture on the radio. Basically says, once the machine after stops, very quickly, lucky we might be able to turn off the power strategically. Actually, he was wrong about that, right? If you especially deal with machine, it's not going to let you off. Actually,
what do you think is meant for quick if we shut off machines that are?
I think it means that we would realize that our area can only fly by this just in time. If it hadn't, then we would have lost.
Are you more worried about the stuff about intelligent AI, or are you more worried about super powerful AI not aligned with our values? Paperclip scenario.
I think the main problem I'm looking on is the control problem. Machine doing objectives that not aligned. And the way we thought about AI is build a machine optimizing and put in some objectives. You can think of this as the King Midas. King Midas put in objective, right? Everything touch you to the gold. God's machine base, right? Done. And you now have this power, and of course, good and can gold. It would be in starvation. This, it's the warning, it's the failure mode that pretty much every culture in history has had some story along this line. Meaning wishes and when Arthur Samuel wrote his checker playing program, which learned checkers, Samuel could play. And Norbert Wiener, who was one of the major mathematicians of the 20th century, or the father of modern automation, he saw this and he extrapolated, as Turing did, how we control. And that you have to be certain that the purpose put into the machine, which we desire. And the problem is, you can't do that.
You mean we're not the code, put our values on paper as code for possible?
The line is very so theoretically it's possible, but in practice unlikely. Specify correctly in advance full range of
You talked about cultural transmission of values.
So yeah, I mean, as we grow up, learn about that matter, how things should go. What is
Big machines can learn in the same kind of way.
yeah, so I think that we need to get away from the idea that build and optimize it objective. Because if it's possible that you might put in a wrong objective, you already know this happens lots of times, right? That means that the machine should never take an objective as given as gospel truth. Because once it takes the objective as gospel truth, right, then it believes that whatever action taking that objective are the jumping up and down and saying, no, you're going to destroy the world, but the machine, the true objective is doing it. But it's not restricted to AI, right? This is many of the 20th century technologies, right? Those minimize a loss function, exogenous theory, minimize the cost function, maximize it, and so on. But all these just how we conceive the problem. And it's the wrong problem. Because we cannot specify the correct uncertain machine, uncertain about what it is supposed to
My favorite idea of purging where, well, I should favorite, but it just sounds beautiful. But when you teach machine,
yeah, I mean,
it's a beautiful way to put it.
That they're humble. They know that they know it's doing, and that those objectives they exist. They're within us. So we may not be able to explicate them. We may not even know how we want the future to go.
Like, exactly.
And the machine that's uncertain is going to be differential. So if we say don't do that, well, now the machine's learned something a bit more about our true objective. Something that it thought was our objective turned out not to be. Now it's learned something. Once doing what we really want. That point, I think, is absolutely solving control. Different kind of AI when you take away this objective mode, and in fact, a lot of the theoretical frameworks that we're so familiar with, Markov decision, goal-based planning, game tree search, all of these techniques actually become applicable. And you get a more complicated problem because now the interaction with the human becomes part of the problem. by making choices, giving you objective information to achieve objective. So that really means that you're mostly dealing with a theoretical machine, human couple together, rather than doing it yourself.
Fascinating on the in the human level that we don't have an objective. We're together coming up with. There's a lot of philosophy, that argue that life doesn't have meaning. To get agree on what meaning and kind of culturally create why the heck we are in this certain way. Together as a society create that meaning from that. And one of the biggest, I thought that's what you were going to go for a second. One of the biggest troubles we've run into outside of statistics, machine and AI, civilization, is when the Soviet Union and history of the century run into when there was the about the objective. You do whatever it takes to achieve that objective. Germany, communist Russia.
Yeah, and I would say with corporations, in fact, some people argue that we don't have to look forward to a time when AI because what they already have corporations, right? And corporations happen using people as right now, but they are effective for the machines that are optimizing objective, which is mostly profit, is the line over being of the human race, and they are destroying them. They are primarily responsible for our inability to climate change. So I think that's one way of thinking about what's going on with corporations. But I think the point you're making is valid. That there are many systems in the world where we prematurely fixed on objectives, coupled the machine from those serving. Government, right? Government is supposed to be that sort of, but instead it tends to be taken over by people who have their own objective, and use government to optimize that objective, regardless of what want.
I find appealing the idea of almost arguing machine. We have multiple AI systems, including a fixed objective. We have the government, the red team, they're very fixed on their objectives. They argue, kind of agree, but it kind of seems to make it somewhat that the duality of it. Okay.
Yeah,
A lot of okay, let's go 100 years back when there was or the founding of the country was that disagreement where so there's a balance between certain forced humility power was defeated.
yeah. I think that the nature of debate argument takes as a premise the idea that which means that you're not necessarily absolutely convinced or objective, correct? Right? If you were absolutely point in having any discussion or argument, you would never change your mind. And anything like that. So I think you can think of argumentation of a form of uncertainty. I've been reading recently about comparing a degree of effort. Define in a mathematical way, I feel like a formula for moral goal thinking. And it's really interesting that the parallels between philosophical discussions 100 years and what you see now, discussions about execution risk, because it's almost exactly the same. So someone would say, okay, well, here's a function of decisions to maximize the sums of everybody, and then point out, well, in that case, best policy is one that enormously vast population, all of whom are living a life fairly worth living, right? And for the Republican conclusion. And another version, that should maximize pleasure, and that's what we mean by utility, and then get people actively saying, well, in that case, might as well have everyone hooked up to a heroin drip. They didn't use those words, but that to me, was happening in the 19th century, as it is now about AI, that if we get the formula wrong, to have AI working towards an outcome that, in retrospect, exactly wrong.
Do you think there's, as beautiful, but the echoes are there, but do you think, if you look at Sam Harris, our imagination of AI, because of the speed at which going wrong, utilitarian happen. Is that a worry for you?
Yeah, I think that in most cases, not in all, but you have a wrong idea that it's starting to go wrong. Okay, maybe that was a mistake. Let's try something different. And also with low innovation, I think you have to worry, have corporations that are. When we look at AI systems, or even computers in general, right, they have this characteristic of ordinary process. So let's say you were a surgeon, had some idea about how to do some operation. Right? Well, let's say you were wrong, right? That way of doing the operation. Well, you'd find out pretty quickly, like after 3 or 4 tries, right? But that isn't true for pharmaceuticals, because they don't do 3 or 4 operations. They manufacture 4 billion pills. They go on and find out months of oh, people are dying of or cancer drug. So that's why we have the FDA of the scalability of and there have been some unbelievable codes history of pharmaceutical operation of drugs that tens of thousands of paralyzed hundreds of thousands. Now with computers, we have that same scalability. There and type for I equals 1, 5. Right? And all of a sudden you're having a platform. And yet we have no FDA, right? It's absolute control for what a bunch of undergraduates much caffeine to the world. And we look at what happens in social media in general and click-through. So you have a simple stack algorithm trying to just optimize. Sounds reasonable, right? Because you don't want to be ads that are interested in. And you might even think of that process as simply adjusting the of ads feed to match people's preferences, right? But in fact, that is how the algorithm works. It makes more money. The algorithm makes more money if you can better predict what you click on. So the way to maximize click-through is actually modify people, make them more predictable. And one way to do that is people change their preference towards heuristic point, that's where you're going to end up. Now, and I think there's a reasonable argument to say, among other things, the world. And where was the oversight of this process? Where were the people saying, okay, we would like to apply this algorithm? Can you show me that it's safe? Show me that it won't have various kinds of negative effects? No, there was no one asking. No one faced the undergrads with too much caffeine and human race.
Well,
it's just this.
Way outside my knowledge, economists would argue will hand the capitalism. It was the if you're going to corrupt society with whatever decision you make in the company, that's going to corrupt it not use the product. That's one model of oversight.
We shall see, but in the meantime, that might even have broken the goals of that function.
Well, you've changed.
And so, we shall see. Yeah.
Changes on behavior. My question is absolutely, you're absolutely right that zero oversight on algorithms that can have a profound change any effect. So, do you think it's possible in in government? Do you think it's possible for everybody's oversight for AI share inherently cutting edge?
Yeah, but I think it takes time to figure out what kind of oversight controls. I mean, time to find some people don't like it. I think there are clear ways. But the whole notion that you have stage 1, 3, criteria for what you have to do on trial, right? What about what those algorithms? I think there are things we can do right now with regard to bias, for example, technical handle on how to detect algorithms propagating bias, data sets, bias algorithms. So I think we can start having some standards. There are things, impersonation of falsification, can work on stuff.
Or
very simple. So impersonation is acting as a person. I can't see a real reason why we should achieve this. Where is the social benefit? I don't mind if it uses like voice. Yeah, that's one to just say, cheat.
And not many people are speaking to that.
Yeah, I mean, there is actually a law in California that bans only purpose of engaging in fraudulent transaction, purpose of those she have to. But I think should be more consistent. And then when you talk about deepfakes, we're just but already possible fake a movie, body saying anything. Ways that can't.
Including yourself because you're on camera now. Me through with high resolution.
Yeah, that's it. So you can saying and replace something else. And my lips, facial expressions. actually not much way of protection against that. I think in the commercial area, you could say you might brand and all the rules of that. But I think anything goes. That could be really,
and just try to an argument, but try to look back at history. Dark, in essence, is while regulation seems to be more precise in exactly the right thing, beings, what they naturally do is they wrong. Their weapon. You can't talk about nuclear weapons actually these drops the bomb or Chernobyl melting. I think we will have to wait for things going wrong in a way that obviously damage society. Not an existential, but obviously damage. Or do you have faith?
I hope not, but I mean, I think we have to look at it. So the two examples you gave, nuclear weapons and power, are very, very interesting. So a nuclear weapon, you, the early years of the 20th century, that atom kind of energy, but we had even word, the mass differences, the components of that might be able to be incredibly powerful. So, 12 science fiction book, 12, Frederick Soddy, isotope, price of investigation, and, 1 pound of explosive, 100 dynamite, up to you, right? One, right? Imagine it, how much would be if we, but the physics establishment, we refuse that made,
including people who are making.
well, so they were doing the nuclear physics,
And eventually, more than one. And talk about for me or whatever.
well, so the development was mostly theoretical, or primitive kinds of acceleration, doing experiments at the level of single particle collection particles. Yet thinking about how to actually formulate it, and you did that might of the establishment. But I think because they did not true was that could not way to there was a famous speech Rutherford Europe. It was on September 11th. One who talks about the ability of painting and shine. The next morning there was about that chain reaction, and he had that idea. Electrons were not repelled by the nucleus to the continuation. He has that idea. He instantly realized that because it was 1933, right? Hitler had come to power. Germany, allied with London, she became a refugee and the process of having the idea about the chain reaction, figured out basically how to make a bomb and also how to make a reaction. Patented for because the situation, our conflict, that is secret. And so between then beginning of World War II, working in German on how to actually create transport, what's fission reactions, neutron, right, energy, continuous reaction. And I was demonstrated in Germany in 1988. The first nuclear weapon patent in 1929 by the French. Actually going on, well before World War going. And the British probably had some areas, but for reasons, among other program, US came. So the reason why have any kind of oversight was basically an arms race in the war. But you mentioned 20s and 30s, so what is the way you describe this? How do you think close to the battle? They really are concerned about it, want to about it. What is the why do you think that is? What are the echoes of the situation and what can we do about it? I think there is a kind of cognition. In psychology, what you would like true, and unsettling that what you're working on might rather deny it, come up with some reason why it couldn't be true. I collected a long list of reasons that extremely intelligent, competent AI scientists come up with why we should worry about it. For example, calculators, they haven't taken it. Oh, there's nothing to worry about. Okay, my 5-year-old figured out why that was looking at it and argument. Another one was, well, it's theoretically possible to have human AI. Well, it's also theoretically possible to have black hole materialize right next to the Earth. Yes, it's pretty unlikely. It's right there. But that's a completely bogus analogy. The whole on Earth materialize a black hole in Earth orbit. You ask them, is that a good idea? Is that going to be safe? What if you say, right? And that's the thing, right? The AI can refute the ask. And initially, I think that was hard. But, Alan Turing asked himself that, and he said, right, if we were lucky, we might be able to switch off the power, but probably
also an aspect that because we're not exactly sure what the future holds, it's not clear technically what to worry about, how things go wrong. And so there is something, it feels like, correct me if I'm wrong, there's something paralyzing about worrying about something that logically is inevitable, but you don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's it's a reasonable point. But certainly in terms of existential risk, different from the asteroid colliding, which again quite possible happened in the past, probably only happen again. We don't write right now. If we did detect an asteroid that
was there's a big rock. Probably have a meeting and see what about AI.
right, what I mean, very Andrew, a lot of the people today in estimates from AI researchers in Asia, they think I'm a more concerned. As happened, weapons
Coming overnight.
it can happen overnight. Have these breakthroughs. Need more than one breakthrough, but on the order of half a dozen. Very rough scale, but so half a dozen breakthroughs of that nature, it would have to happen from but the AI research lost now massive investments from governments, from corporations, tons of really, really smart people just happen to look at the rate of progress in different areas of AI really fast. Hey, oh, it's basic. So I see, for example, Stanford 100 AI project. Those demos what actually said if you want perfect style, that's it. Because the whole history of AI, they philosophers said it was no idea what you're talking about. Of course, it's you can argue why there isn't. And now, because people are worried, bad name, or I just worry about this, saying, okay, imagine, right? Imagine if the leaders of cancer biology got up and said, well, of course, curing cancer is not very possible. Complete outrage and I find phenomenon. So, okay, so if you accept it's possible, if you accept that horrible going, the point that you're making is, how does it go wrong? A valid question. Without that, without an answer to that question, then you're stuck with problem things, right? They made something more intelligent than them, namely us, a few years ago, and now they're you. So nothing they can do, they've lost control. Failed to solve the control problem of controlling and we don't want to be in that situation. The problem is before you have what you can do. Other than to say, okay, we should try to stop. We should just not make the case, not make the AI. I think that's really hard. I'm not actually proposing that's I also think that if controlled AI could be better than beneficial. So, but it seems to me that there's a consensus that one of the major failures of control create AIs being incorrect and cause AIs to use those because listen to us and just carrying out strategy that in a process to spending my own experience, and that collection of problems, I think, is something. The other problems are, roughly speaking, even if we solve all the make control AI system, why does it really go out of control? That's one problem, which is the problem, partly cultural profession, teach people.
Talk a lot of time with how technical great awesome
That's another topic I have, but what I mentioned, what I see is the third stage of overuse, that we become overly dependent, fully the beauty, all right, all of human spaceship machines look after for them, they just watch the big gulps, and they're all sort of totally lost any notion of, and so in effect, right, what happens gradually, more and more of the management of machines, as we are already doing, or as it continues, we sort of gradually switch from being the master technology, right? So to become guest shift, fine for a week, but not for the, and it's almost irreversible. Right? Once you lose the incentive to, for example, in education or doctor or a station or any other ways that we gain a property, don't have the incentive that work, and it's to recover.
yeah, just one of the technology that result all the other technology in general. Not just from
Doesn't think that the difference that the knowledge on our civilization, up to now we've had no alternative, but
with software, with Google, I mean, the software in general, so AI broadly.
computers in general, but the knowledge of how how sanitation is, that's it. The AI has to understand that. So we've always put knowledge on paper, but paper doesn't run our civilization. It runs from paper. Always propagated civilization. We tend to power it. And right, look it out. Should have been about the big stuff to keep the civilization going.
Way to the goals.
And now we're changing quite that way. So the problem that AI, if we do our job right, the AI system say, the human race doesn't, in the long run, want cruise ship. It wants autonomy, pardon. So the AI systems are not going to do that for you. You've got to do it yourself, right? I'm not going to carry you to the top of Everest. Helicopter, you have to climb it. So on. So, but I'm afraid that because we are short-sighted, to override. There's an amazing short story that I recommend everyone talking about it, called Machine Tops. 1909 by Ian. about British Empire and costume dramas on the TV. But he wrote this one science fiction story, which is an amazing vision of the future. iPad. I had a conference. Computer. I mean, literally, it's what people spend their time doing, giving online courses or listening to online and talking about ideas, but they never get out there in the real world. They don't really have a lot of face-to-face contact. Everything's done online. So all the things we're worrying about now were described in the story, and then the race becomes more and more machine knowledge of how run, and then becomes vulnerable to collapse. And so it's a pretty unbelievably amazing story in 1990. Magical.
So there's very few people that represent artificial intelligence, or so
it was all my fault.
Oh, there you go. Right. You're often brought up as the person, well, Russell, the AI person, worried about. That's why you should be worried about. Do you feel the burden of that? I don't know if you feel that at all. When I talk to people, like talk about people outside of science, think about this. Joe Russell is worried about AI, so you should be worried.
I mean, in practical sense, yeah, because I get dozens, sometimes 5 invitations a day to talk about it, write articles and so on. So, that very practical sense, I'm seeing that people are concerned and interested about it.
Are you worried that you could be wrong all the time?
Of course, I worry about that. That's always been the way that I would. You know, like I have an argument I had with myself. I have some idea, then okay, how could that be wrong? Or I already have that idea. I'll go and get as much literature as I can, whether someone else thought of that or even refused. So, right now I'm reading a lot of philosophy because in the form of debates, utilitarianism, other moral population, I've already thought through so many issues, but one of the things I'm not seeing is idea about unobjective way to think about beneficial. The idea of beneficial based on concept. My gut feeling is this core. I'm going to have to elaborate in a lot of different directions. There are a lot of belief in it. It has to be, right? We can't afford hand there are, whenever we do hand wavy stuff, there's a thing about money. Just like taxes. If you don't write your tax law properly, that people will find the loopholes and they'll pay your tax. You should think this way. And getting those definitions right, it's a long process. You can define mathematical frameworks within that framework. Terms, yes. Theoretical and but that framework may not match the world in a crucial way.
The boring process. Last question. I can answer it. What is your favorite sci-fi movie?
I'd say Stella has the movie stage, and actually, in some way, makes you think in a nervous kind of way about feeling.
Following conversation with Professor Berkeley, the director of the Berkeley Robotics Learning Lab, one of the top researchers in the world on how we make robots understand, interact with the world around them, especially patient learning. This conversation is part of the MIT course Artificial General Intelligence and the Artificial Intelligence podcast. Enjoy it. Subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, podcast provider of choice, or simply click me on Twitter of FRID. Now, here's my conversation. You mentioned that if there was one person, Roger Federer, let me ask you, when do you think we'll have a robot that fully autonomous Roger Federer at Roger Federer level?
Well, first, if you could make it happen for me to be Roger, let me know. Things with getting a robot to him at tennis. It's kind of an interesting question because for a lot of the challenges we think about in AI, the software is really a piece. But for something like this, the hardware is nowhere near either. Really have a robot that can physically run around. Boston Dynamics robots are starting to get there, but still not really human level. The ability to run around and then swing a racket.
Let's see, that's a hardware problem.
I don't think it's a hardware problem only. I think it's a hardware and a software problem. I think it's both. And I think they'll have independent progress. So the hardware maybe in 10, 15 years.
Wait, on grass.
Like a sliding. Well, the clay, I'm not sure what's harder, grass or clay. The clay involves sliding, which might be harder to master. Yeah.
Not limited to by people.
So to build a machine, different question, of course. This robot can be on wheels, move around on wheels, and design differently. Then I think that can be done sooner probably than a full humanoid type of setup.
What do you think of swing a racket? You worked at station. How hard is the task of swinging a racket to be able to get a nice backhand or a forehand?
Let's say we just set up a nice robot arm, let's a standard industrial arm, and you can watch the ball come and then swing the racket. It's a good question. I'm not sure it would be super hard. I mean, I'm sure it would require a lot. I would agree with reinforcement learning would require a lot of trial and error. It's not going to swing it right the first time around, but yeah, I don't see why it couldn't swing it the right way. I think it's learnable. You set up a ball machine, let's say on one side, and then a robot with a tennis racket on the other side. I think it's learnable. Maybe a little bit of pre-training and simulation. I think that's feasible. I think this swinging the racket. It'll be very interesting to see how much. I mean, that's where some of the human players can hit on the line, which is very high precision with spin.
When the RL could learn to put a spin on the ball.
Well, you got me interested. I will set this up. You got me intrigued.
Your answer is for this problem it's not fascinating, but for the general problem, farther away. What's the most impressive scene about work?
So physically, for me, the Boston Dynamics videos always bring home and super impressed. Recently, the robot running up the
scares during the parkour type thing. Yes, we don't know what's underneath. We don't really provide a lot of detail, but even if it's hard coded underneath, might or might not be just the physical abilities of doing that parkour. That's a
So, right? Have you met Spot Mini or any other robots in person?
Spot Mini last year in April at Mars event that Jeff Bezos organizes. Brought it out there, and he was nicely flying around Jeff. Jeff left the room and had it follow him along, which is pretty impressive.
I think there's some confidence in learning on those robots. The psychology of it, while knowing there's not learning. I met Spot Mini earlier, and knowing everything that's going on, having one-on-one interaction, like at time alone. And there's immediately a deep connection psychologically. Even though you know the fundamentals of how it works, it matches. So, do you think about the psychology of interacting with robots in the world? Even you showed me R2, the robot, and there's a little bit something like a face, and a little bit something like a face that immediately draws you. About that aspect of the robotics problem.
Well, it's very hard we'll give him a name, Berkeley robot for the elimination of tedious tasks. It's very hard to think of the robot as a person, and it seems like everybody calls him a he for whatever reason, but that also makes it more a person than if it was a it. And it seems pretty natural to think of it that way. This past weekend really struck me. I've seen Pepper many times on videos, but then I was at an event organized by Fidelity, and they had scripted Pepper to help moderate sessions, and they had scripted Pepper to have the personality of a child a little bit, and it was very hard to not think of it as its own person in some sense. It was just going to jump in the conversation and make it very interactive. Moderator and Pepper would just jump in. Hold on, how about me? I participated in this doing it. Just like, hey, this is like a person. And that was 100%. Even then, it was hard not to have that sense of somehow there is something there.
So as we have robots interact, does that like personal learning work a little bit in this direction? But do you think that psychology can help?
That's a question that a lot of people ask, and I think part of why they ask it is they're thinking about how unique are we really still as people? Like after they see some results, they see computer play go, they say computer this, that, they're like, okay, but can it really have emotion? Can it really interact with us in that way? And then once you're around robots, you already start feeling it, and I think that kind of maybe methodologically, the way that I think of it is, if you run something like reinforcement learning, it's about optimizing some objective, and no reason that the object couldn't be tied into how much does a person like interacting with this system, and why could not the reinforcement learning system optimize for the robot being fun to be around, and why wouldn't it then naturally become more and more interactive and more like a person or like a pet? I don't know what it would exactly be, but more and more have those features and acquire them automatically.
As long as you formalize an objective, like how do you accept the ground truth? How do you get the reward from humans? You have to collect that information. They're saying formulate as an objective.
There's no reason it couldn't emerge through learning, and if it one way to formulate as an objective, you wouldn't have to explore it explicitly. So standard rewards are numbers. Numbers are hard to come by. This is a 1.5 or 1.7 on some scale. Very hard to do for a person. But much easier is for a person to say, okay, what you did the last 5 minutes was much nicer than what you did the previous 5 minutes, and that now gives a comparison. And in fact, there has been results of that. For example, Paul Cristiano and collaborators at OpenAI had Hopper, Joko Hopper, a one-legged robot, doing little backflips purely from feedback. I liked it better than that. That's kind of equally good. And after a bunch of interactions, it figured out what it was the person was asking for, namely a backflip. I think the same thing
It wasn't trying to do a backflip. It was just getting the person to go for the first.
Person having in mind, in their own mind, I want to do a backflip, but the robot didn't know what it was supposed to be doing. It just knew that sometimes the person said this is better, this is worse, and then the robot figured out what the person was actually after with the backflip. And I imagine the same would be true for things like more interactive robots, that the robot would figure out over time, oh, this apparently is appreciated more than this other kind of thing.
So when I first picked up Sutton Rich's learning book, before Sutton learning, before the emergence that was powerful explanation, RL seemed like magic. It's beautiful. So that seemed like what intelligence, RL, reinforcement learning. So, how do you think possibly learn anything about the world or way is sparse? Where is why do you think RL works? Why do you think you can learn anything such sparse whether it's learning deeper?
The counterpart of that is, why is RL, why does it need so many samples, so many experiences to learn from? Because really what's happening is when you have a sparse reward, you do something, maybe for like, I don't know, you take 100 actions and then you get a reward. Maybe you get like a score of 3. And I'm like, okay, 3. Not sure what that means. You go again and now I get 2. And now you know that that sequence of 100 actions that you did the second time around somehow was worse than the sequence of 100 actions you did the first time around. But that's enough to now know which one of those were better or worse. Some might have been good and bad in either one. So that's why I need so many experiences. But once you have enough experiences, effectively RL is teasing that apart. It's trying to say, okay, what is consistently there when you get a higher reward, and what's consistently there when you get a lower reward? And then the magic of the policy gradient update is to say, now let's update the neural network to make the actions that were kind of present when things are good more likely, and make the actions that are present when things are not as good less likely.
That is the counterpoint, but it seems like you would need to run it a lot more. You know, right now RL is very inefficient, but it seems to be way more efficient than one would imagine on paper. Simple update policy gradient that somehow you can learn exactly what are the common actions seem to produce some good results. That somehow can learn anything. It's counterintuitive. Some intuition behind
it.
it.
So I think there's a few ways to think about this. The way I tend to think about it mostly originally when we started working on deep reinforcement learning here at Berkeley in 2011, 12, 13, around that time, John Schulman was a PhD student initially driving it forward here. And the way we thought about it at the time was, if you think about rectified linear units, or rectified type neural networks, what do you get? You get something that's piecewise linear feedback control. And if you look at the literature, linear feedback control is extremely successful. It can solve many, many problems surprisingly well. I remember, for example, when we did helicopter flight, if you're in a stationary flight, not a non-stationary, but a stationary flight regime like hover, you can use linear feedback control to stabilize a helicopter. It's a very complex dynamical system, but the controller is relatively simple. And so I think that's a big part, is that if you do feedback control, even though the system you control can be very, very complex, relatively simple control architecture can already do a lot, but then also just linear is not good enough. And so one way you can think of these neural networks is that they tile the space, which people were already trying to do more by hand or with finite state machines. Say, this linear controller here, this linear controller here. Neural network learns to tile the space and say linear controller here, another linear controller here, but it's more subtle than that. So it's benefiting from this linear control aspect, it's benefiting from the tiling, but it's somehow tiling it one dimension at a time. If let's say you have a 2-layer network, even that hidden layer, you make a transition from active to inactive or the other way around. That is essentially one axis, not axis of the line, but one direction that you change. And so you have this kind of very gradual tiling of the space. We have a lot of sharing between the linear controllers that tile the space. And that was always my intuition as to why I expect that this might work pretty well. It's essentially leveraging the fact that linear feedback control is so good, but of course not enough. And this is a gradual tiling of the space with linear feedback controls that share a lot of expertise.
So that's really nice intuition. Do you think that scales the more and more general problems start going up? The number of controls you mentioned, when you start going down in terms of how often you get clean reports of them, report to the create worlds that we real.
So I think where things get really tricky in the real world compared to the things we've looked at so far with great success in reinforcement learning is time scales, which takes us to an extreme. So when you think about the real world, I mean, I don't know, maybe some student decided to do a PhD, right? Okay, that's a decision, that's a very high level decision. But if you think about their lives, I mean, any person's life, it's a sequence of muscle fiber contractions, relaxations, and that's how you interact with the world. That's a very high frequency control thing, but it's ultimately what you do, how you affect the world. You know, I guess we have readings, you can maybe do it slightly differently, but typically that's how you affect the world. And the decision of doing a PhD is so abstract relative to what you're actually doing in the world. And I think that's where credit assignment becomes completely beyond what any current RL algorithm can do, and we need hierarchical reasoning at a level that is just not available at all yet.
Where do you think we can pick up reasoning? By which mechanism?
Yeah, so maybe let me highlight what I think the limitations are of what already was done 20, 30 years ago. In fact, you'll find reasoning systems that reason for relatively long horizons, but the problem is that we're not grounded in the real world. So people would have to hand design some kind of logical, dynamical descriptions of the world, and that didn't tie into perception. And so it didn't tie into real objects. And that was a big gap. Now with deep learning, start having the ability to really see with sensors, process that, and understand what's in the world. So it's a good time to try to bring these things together. And I see a few ways of getting there. One way to get there would be to say deep learning can get bolted on somehow to these more traditional approaches. Now, bolted on would probably mean you need to do kind of end-to-end training where you say, my deep learning processing somehow leads to a representation that in turn uses some kind of traditional underlying dynamical systems that can be used for planning. And that's, for example, the direction Aviv Tamar and Bernard Kuretashir have been pushing with causal infoGAN, and of course other people too. That's one way. Can we somehow force it into the form factor that is amenable to reasoning? Another direction we've been thinking about for a long time and didn't make any progress on was more information theoretic approaches. So the idea there was that what it means to take high-level action is to take and choose a latent variable now that tells you a lot about what's going to be the case in the future, because that's what it means to take a high-level action. But aside, I'm going to navigate to the gas station, gas for my car. Well, that'll now take 5 minutes to get there. But the fact that I get there, I could already tell that from the high-level action I took much earlier. That we had a very hard time getting success with. Not saying it's a dead end necessarily, but we had a lot of trouble getting that to work. And then we started revisiting the notion of what are we really trying to achieve? What we're trying to achieve is not necessarily hierarchy per se, but you can think about what does hierarchy give us? What we hope it would give us is better credit assignment. Kind of what this better credit assignment is giving us, it gives us faster learning, right? And so faster learning is ultimately maybe what we're after. And so that's what we ended up with RL squared paper on learning to reinforcement learn, at the time Rocket One led, and that's exactly the meta learning approach where you say, okay, we don't know how
right? Emerging, we saw things emerge. The maze navigation had consistent motion down hallways, which is what you want. A hierarchical control should say, I want to go down this hallway. And then when there's an option to take a turn, I can decide whether to take a turn or not and repeat. Even had the notion of, where have you been before or not? Do not revisit the place you've been before. It still didn't scale yet. The real world kind of scenarios, I think you had in mind, but it was kind of one that maybe you could meta learn these hierarchical concepts.
I mean, it seems like through these meta learning concepts, get at what I think is one of the hardest problems. Yeah, which is transfer learning, generalization. How far journey to learning general system, being able to do transfer learning well? Fine, can generalize a little bit. But do you think we're on the right path? Where totally different breakthroughs are needed to be able to transfer knowledge between different learners?
Yeah, I'm pretty torn on this. That I think there are some very impressive results. There's just some very impressive results already, right? I mean, I would say when even with the initial kind of big breakthrough in 2012 with AlexNet, right? The initial thing is okay, great. This does better on ImageNet enhanced image recognition, but then immediately thereafter, of course, wow, what was learned on ImageNet, and you now want to solve a new task, you can fine-tune AlexNet for new tasks, and that was often found to be an even bigger deal. That you learned something that was reusable, which was not often the case before. In machine learning, you learn something for one scenario, and that was it.
And it's really exciting. That's probably learning in terms of hope.
That was a huge breakthrough, and then I feel like similar kind of by scaling things up, like this has been expanded upon. Like people training even bigger networks, they might transfer even better. If you looked at, for example, AI results on language models and the recent Google results on language models, they're learned prediction, and then they get reused for other tasks. So I think there is something there where somehow if you train a big enough model on enough things, things to transfer some deep mind result that were very impressive, unreal result, where it was learned to navigate mazes, where it wasn't just doing reinforcement learning, but it had other objectives, optimizing for. So I think there's a lot of interesting results already. I think maybe where it's hard to wrap my head around this, to which extent or when do we call something generalization, right? Or the levels of generalization involved in these different tasks, right? So
you draw this, by the way, just to frame heard you say somewhere, the difference between learning to master versus generalize. That's a nice line to think about in the gray area of what learning to master one starts.
I think I might have heard this. I heard it somewhere else, and I think it might have been one of your interviews, maybe the one with Joshua Benjamin. Not 100% sure, but I like the example, and not sure who it was, but the example was essentially if you use current deep learning techniques, what we're doing to predict, let's say, the relative motion of our planets, it would do pretty well. But then now, if a massive new mass, our solar system, it would probably not predict what will happen, right? That's a different kind of generalization. That's a generalization that relies on the ultimate simplest explanation that we have available today to explain the motion of planets, whereas just pattern recognition could predict our current solar system motion pretty well, no problem. And so I think that's an example of a kind of generalization that is a little different from what we've achieved so far, and it's not clear if just regularizing more and forcing it to come up with a simpler explanation. But it's not simple, but that's what physics researchers do, right? They say, can I make this even simpler? How simple can I get this? The simplest equation that can explain everything, right? The master equation for the entire dynamics of the universe. We haven't really pushed that direction as hard in deep learning, I would
would say. Not sure if it should be pushed, but it seems the kind of generalization you get from that you don't get in our current method.
I just talked to Vladimir Babnik, the definition of the learning, and he kind of dreams of reading. He echoes E equals MC squared for learning, right? General theory of learning. I think that's pursuit near term, next couple decades.
I think that's brilliant. In the following sense, that there's a lot of evidence that the brain is pretty modular. So I wouldn't maybe think of it as a theory, maybe the underlying theory, but more kind of the principle. Where there have been findings where people who are blind will use the part of the brain usually used for vision or other functions. And even after kind of will get rewired and able to use their brain for other functions. So what that suggests is kind of modularity, and I think it is a pretty natural thing to try for to see, can we find that modularity? Can we find this thing? Of course, it's not every part of the brain is not exactly the same. Not everything can be rewired arbitrarily. But if you think of things like the neocortex, which is a pretty big part of the brain, that seems fairly modular from what the findings so far. Can you design something equally modular, and if you can just grow it, it becomes more capable, probably? I think that would be the interesting underlying principle to shoot for that is not unrealistic.
Do you think you prefer math or empirical trial and error for the discovery of the essence of what it means to be intelligent? So, reinforcement learning embodies both. Prove that something converges, prove the bound, and at the same time, a lot of those successes are, let's try this with people first. Which you gravitate towards. How do you think of those two parts of your brain?
So, maybe I would prefer we could make the progress with mathematics. And the reason maybe I would prefer that is because often if you have something you can mathematically formalize, you can leapfrog a lot of experimentation. And experimentation takes a long time to get through, and a lot of trial and error kind of reinforcement in your research process. But you need to do a lot of trial and error before you get to that. So if you can leapfrog that, in my mind, that's what the math is about. And once you do a bunch of experiments, start seeing a pattern, you can do some derivations that leapfrog some experiments. But I agree with you. I mean, in practice, a lot of the progress has been such that we have not been able to find the math that allows us to leapfrog ahead. But we are kind of making gradual progress one step at a time. New experiment here, new experiment there, that gives us new insights and gradually building up, but not getting something yet where we're just, okay, here's an equation that now explains how, that would be 2 years of experimentation to get there, but this tells us what the result's going to be. Unfortunately, not so much yet.
Not so much yet, but your hope is there. In trying to teach robots systems, everyday tasks, even implementation, what do you think you're more excited about? Imitation learning or self-play? So letting robots learn from humans, or letting robots play on their own, try to figure out their own way, and eventually interact with solve whatever problem. What's the more exciting to you? What's more promising direction?
So when we look at self-play, what's so beautiful about it is it goes back to kind of the challenges of reinforcement learning. So the challenge of reinforcement is getting signal. If you don't never succeed, you don't get any signal. In self-play, you're on both sides. So one of you succeeds. The beauty is also one of you fails. And so you see the contrast. You see the one version of me that is better than the other version. And so every time you play yourself, you get signal. And so whenever you can turn something into self-play, you're in a beautiful situation where you can naturally learn much more quickly than in most other reinforcement learning environments. So I think if somehow we can turn more reinforcement learning problems into self-play formulation, that would go really, really far. So so far self-play has been largely around games, where there's natural opponents. But if we could do self-play for other things, and then a robot learns to build a house. I mean, that's a pretty advanced thing to try to do for a robot, but maybe it tries to build a hut or something. If that can be done through self-play, it would learn a lot more quickly if somebody can figure it out. And I think that would be something where it goes closer to kind of the mathematical leapfrogging, where somebody figures out a formalism to, okay, any RL problem, playing this and this idea, you can turn it into a self-play problem where you get a signal a lot more easily. The reality is, many problems we don't know how to do self-play. And so either we need to provide detailed rewards that doesn't just reward for achieving a goal, but rewards for making progress, that becomes time consuming. And once we're starting to do that, let's say you want a robot to do something, you need to give all this detailed reward, well, why not just give a demonstration? Why not just show the robot? And now the question is, how do you show the robot? One way to show is to tally operate the robot. And the robot really experiences it. And that's nice because that's really high signal-to-noise ratio data. And we've done a lot of that. And you teach your robot skills. In just 10 minutes, you can teach your robot a new basic skill. Like, okay, pick up the bottle, place it somewhere else. That's a skill. No matter where the bottle starts, maybe it always goes onto a target. That's fairly easy to teach your robot with teleop. Now, the more interesting is you can now teach your robot through third-person learning, where the robot watches you do something and doesn't experience it, but watches it and says, okay, well, if you're showing me that, that means I should be doing this, and I'm not going to be using your hand because I don't get to control your hand, but I'm going to use my hand and do that mapping. And so that's where I think one of the big breakthroughs happened this year, was led by Chelsea Finn here. It's almost like learning a machine translation for demonstrations, where you have a human demonstration, and the robot learns to translate it into what it means for the robot to do it. And that was a meta-learning formulation. Learn from one, get the other. And that, I think, opens up a lot of opportunities to learn a lot more quickly.
My focus on autonomous vehicles, I think this approach, person watching the autonomous driving, approach.
So for autonomous driving, I would say it's third person is quite easy. And the reason I'm going to say it's slightly easier is third person because the power dynamics are very well understood. So
Easier than first person.
I think easier than. So I think the distinction between third person and first person is not a very important distinction for autonomous driving. They're very similar because the distinction is really about who turns the steering wheel, and or maybe let me put it differently. How to get from a point where you are now to a point, let's say, a couple of meters in front of you, and that's a problem that's very well understood. And that's the only distinction between third and first person. Whereas with robot manipulation, interaction forces are very complex and still a very different thing. For autonomous driving, I think there's still the question imitation versus RL. So imitation gives you a lot more signal. I think where imitation is lacking, needs some extra machinery. It doesn't, in its normal format, doesn't think about goals or objectives. And of course, there are versions of imitation learning, inverse reinforcement learning type imitation learning, which also think about goals. I think then we're getting much closer. But I think it's very hard to think of a fully reactive car generalizing well. If it really doesn't have a notion of objectives, generalize well the kind of generality that you want. You want more than just that reactivity that you get from just behavioral cloning / supervised learning.
A lot of the work, whether it's self-play or even machine learning, simulation, you're doing a lot of stuff in the world, and you have more greater and greater power of simulation, boundless eventually, where most of them operate in the world related, be directly transferable to the world, or still very far away.
So I think you can rephrase that question in some sense. And then, so the power of simulation, right? As simulators get better and better, of course, becomes stronger, and we can learn more simulation. But there's also another version where you say the simulator doesn't even have to be precise. As long as it's somewhat representative. And instead of trying to get one simulator that is sufficiently precise to learn and transfer the real world, I'm going to build many simulators. Some simulators, not any single one of them is sufficiently representative of the real world such that it would work if you train in there. But if you train in all of them, then there is something that's in all of them. The real world will just be another one. That's not one of them, but just another one of them.
Another sample. We live in this one other one.
I'm not sure about that, but definitely a very advanced simulator if it is.
Yeah, pretty good one. Talk to Mr. Russell. I think about it a little bit too. Of course, you're like really trying to build. But do you think about the future of AI? A lot of people have concern about. How do you think about AI safety as you build robots that are operating in the world? What is the how do you approach problem in an engineering way and systematic way?
So, what a robot is doing, things going to have notions of safety to worry about. One is that the robot is shown and first a lot of damage. Thanks to cars, what think of us robots do in some way. This could be completely unintentional. So it could be not the kind of long-term AI safety concerns that okay, AI is smarter than us and now but it could be very practical. Okay, robot if it what are the results going to be? Of course, simulation comes in a lot there to test in simulation. Difficult question. And I'm always wondering, let's say you
What up, Pam?
go back to drugs.
Right now. All right. I'm going to the gym right now. Saying hello. All right. Just. Yeah, I'm fine. You gonna go to the gym and work on your hand-eye coordination so that you don't suck dick at mini golf? Well, I apologize. Apologies. I don't mean to offend you. I'm just giving you some shit. Actually, makes it very hard for me to have a boob under me. Well, how was I supposed to know that? We've known each other for a year, and this is the first you've ever mentioned it. Yes, it's okay. I'm gonna say something a little bit controversial, right? There are a lot of neurodivergence out there, and like there's a lot that's misdiagnosed because autism is heavily like misdiagnosed. So there's a lot of people that go undiagnosed for these neurodivergencies that they don't know about because the awareness for autism is so high, it just fucking and the same with ADHD. I do have ADHD as well, but the awareness for autism is so high that no one knows about this neurodivergency. This is like actually more common than autism. Okay. So does that mean I can't make fun of how you play mini golf anymore? All right. Well, you suck dick at it. When are you gonna improve? I'm gonna get practice more. All right. Do you want to practice now? You'll get more viral. When you go viral, we'll raise more awareness about neurodivergence. Well, yeah, everybody's going to want an explanation as to why you suck dick at mini golf. So, yeah, everyone in the world will know. All right. So you're off to the gym. How much longer is your ride to the gym? In about 2 to 3 minutes, and I'm going to walk to the gym, which will take about 5 to 10. All right. But when you're done,
And you're willing to spend some time working on your hand-eye coordination.
Yeah, I'm gonna do an hour and what's the time now? 3:30 year up. By the time I get in the gym, it's like 3:35. So yeah, it would be 4:35. And it takes me out to get home. So about 6 hours. Would be about 3.5 hours from now.
All right, that's perfect. I'd love to play with you then. Aside from that, how's your day going?
Going to first from
You're doing a first aid conference right now? Oh, okay. How's that going?
flying.
All right. What's up, Bunny?
Okay.
How you living, Pimp?
I'll finish the side.
Very cool. Well, welcome to my Discord. Do you mind if I tell you about myself?
No, go ahead.
Excellent. I'm Rabbi Rothschild. I stream my life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for world peace. I've been doing so for more than 3.5 years. My streams go back to the pandemic. We've seen the death of a queen, the birth of AI, the coronation of a king, and everything in between. According to The Economist magazine in 2018, data overtook petroleum as Earth's #1 resource. And I have more data archived than any person in global history, which may make me an influential person today. Bunny, have you ever seen the movie The Truman Show or the television show Big Brother?
I've heard about. I think it's one of those reality shows. Show I have heard about, but
That's okay. So The Truman Show is the story of a man whose every moment of life is on camera. Essentially, the only difference is that we have my consent to do this, and in that movie, they did not have his consent. But I feel that this can be studied in the future. In the past, people would have written a diary or a journal, and what makes me different is that I essentially have video archives. I have the world's largest time capsule or timeline. It is something that I want to use as a platform to be able to help with global issues, such as ending world hunger through the use of technology, such as agricultural drones, saltwater greenhouses, floating greenhouses, hydroponics, vertical farming, cloud seeding. I'm sponsored by a cryptocurrency known as Harry Potter Obama Sonic 10 Inu. I know it sounds like a lot, but it is worth tens of millions of dollars. It is a project that has built wells in developing nations such as Nigeria. I want to help with those types of endeavors to help end world thirst. Additionally, I'm a major advocate for the Lifestrap program, but most importantly, I'm an advocate for the technology known as desalination, essentially where we pump Earth's seawater onto land to make it drinkable for the common person. I talk about other things that aren't normally discussed in society, things like anti-gravity, antimatter, faster than light travel, faster than light communication, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence. Right now we're watching documentaries, or I should say podcasts, on artificial intelligence. I talk about things like alien disclosure and life extension technology. When you were born, Bunny, the average life expectancy for you was probably about age 80. I'm going to increase that to age 100, 120 through the use of technology. And if you're like, well, everything that you say sounds good, I don't think I'm going to be able to afford that, though. I want to help everybody who's helped me along the way. So, what does that mean for you? I want to make sure that you're able to afford these things and also be able to start charities and philanthropic organizations that are near and dear to your heart to help people. Some of the extension technologies that I want you to be able of which I want you to be able to take advantage are things like oxygen therapy, human growth hormone, stem cells, things like nootropics, cryonics, cryogenics, things like perhaps cold shock therapy and ambrosia therapy. But eventually you'll be 100 years old or 120 years old and you may say, Rabbi, this has been really great, but my body's starting to break down. What's the next type of
What's the next plan? The next plan is a type of technology. Again, this is all with your consent. So if you just want to die at a normal age, Bunny, you're allowed to do that. I don't want to interfere with that. But if you want something more, which many of us do in the transhumanist philosophy, there's something known as mind uploading technology, where, with your consent, very important, we scan your brain like a CAT scan or an MRI, knowing where every atom is in your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system, into a computer for later download.
You know what?
Go ahead. I appreciate that. Thank you. So essentially what we'd be able to do is know where every atom is in your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system for later download as an android, an avatar, a cyborg, a cybernetic being, a clone of yourself, a robot, an ethereal being, whatever you want to be. But Bunny, what I'm saying to you is that there may be an opportunity at digital immortality. I'm glad you think that's genius. I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah, I think that that's cheap. I think that it'd be realistic. I guess that would be for eternity.
100%. That's what digital immortality is, my friend.
That's great. Wow.
I agree.
That is incredible.
I agree. So we're just watching podcasts on that topic and similar topics. Um, Essentially, I'm available to you 100% of the time. Sometimes I'm asleep though. But if you ever need anything, I want you to know I'm here to support you. I am someone who wants to be a positive person in your life, who helps to bring you joy, who helps to have an optimistic view, and just to give people hope. So if you ever need anything, Bunny, you should know I'm always here to help you. Okay?
But I think that's fantastic. I don't think it gets any more welcoming than that.
Excellent. I don't either. So with that, feel free to watch a podcast. We have people who come in and out. We've got people in Australia. The person who just left there from Australia. So a little bit later we'll be playing some games. I've got other people in here who are either perhaps they're sleeping. They like to sleep in here just to be part of the community and to essentially just have that connection to other people. And you're welcome to stay for the rest of your life if you'd like. So, with that, I'm going to continue playing the Lex Friedman podcast just to give you a breakdown of what I like to watch. I'm really into podcasts and learning. Most recently, we did a marathon of Kill Tony. Do you know what Kill Tony is, Bunny?
No, I'm not.
That's okay. It's the largest live podcast in the world. It takes place generally every Monday from the Comedy Mothership, which is located in Austin, Texas. That's Joe Rogan's comedy club, and they've been doing it for 12 years. Oh, excellent! I'm a big advocate of his podcast, so I watch Joe Rogan podcast quite often. We That's actually on the agenda for perhaps the next podcast that I'm going to do a marathon of. Right now, we're doing Lex Friedman, which is on like AI and international relations and robotics. Yeah. In what? Yeah, I'm a futurist, most certainly. So I think AI has a central role in the future of humanity. I just finished up. Go ahead. You're okay. No, no issue at all. If you have something to say, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that AI is very impressive. I mean, we've come a long way over the years. Think about the past few decades. Like even Jetson, like in those times, people had thought that that all these things happened. We've made a lot of technological advances. Imagine if we could go back then and show them what we've accomplished. If we had a time machine, that'd be pretty incredible. Unfortunately, we don't, but maybe one day.
That's absolutely correct, and that's the right mentality to have. You should know that given enough time, anything is possible, even time travel.
Yeah, that's a concept of time travel. I think it's a really cool concept.
I do as well. The main issue with time travel is generally what's known as the grandfather paradox. It's the idea of what happens if you go back in time and kill your grandfather? What happens to you? And basically, our minds can't wrap itself or themselves around what happens in that scenario. There are other paradoxes that involve time travel as well, but that's a big one. But the idea is that maybe perhaps there may be a way to manipulate space time to be able to travel back in time and without manipulating anything in too much of a way that you'd be able to perhaps interact with the world.
I yeah, that you mentioned that there's a lot of and try to figure out like I guess Morty and the dimensions and
That's absolutely correct. Rick and Morty, Family Guy touches on this. It even goes back to Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court.
yeah, no, that would have been a really long time ago. Would you say that whatever time would that?
Well, King Arthur generally may, in modern day, may have been fictional, but let's get the exact amount of time. So I use AI in order to get accurate answers. I mean, I can give you a pretty good one. I would say probably something like maybe, oh, King Arthur, probably 1,000 years or so. Um, but why not get a better determination on the years? So just one moment. Here we go. How long ago approximately was King Arthur's court? All right. So anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 years ago.
Okay, so put that into perspective. Are we talking like Roman Empire times? Like, is that what we're talking about here?
So the fall
Like,
of the fall of the Roman Empire generally is 476 of the Common Era. So we're looking at perhaps a couple centuries or as many as a few centuries after that.
okay.
Do you have any other questions?
No, not at all. No.
Excellent.
I
No, no problem at all. So we just finished up watching a marathon of Kill Tony, which is the largest live podcast in the world, which is has just been um, transitioned to go from YouTube to Netflix. So it's actually on Netflix right now, and they just did some arena shows. They've done the Forum in LA. They've done Madison Square Garden. So it's quite a big show. And now we're doing Lex Friedman podcast. There may be some other podcasts that we're going to do, but then we're going to do the Joe Rogan podcast perhaps. To watch every moment of every Joe Rogan podcast is approximately, at this point, 300 days. So that would take us basically to the end of the year. But I just always have something going on. Uh, so you can see, what my screen looks like. I have a camera pointed at the laptop. Many times people ask me, well, Rabbit, why don't you just share your screen on the laptop? I would love to. It is, there's an issue that occurs that um, the app crashes with Discord, or it just runs into issues. And at least this way, it doesn't have as many technical glitches. So apologies, it's not as high def, but the sound is quite good. And if you ever need anything again, I'm here for you. Right now, they're in a discussion, Lex and his guest. We just started this marathon today. We're on like episode 9 or 10 or something. Um, we have discussions on AI, the things that we just talked about. Why are we here? Are we alone? The big questions of society. Where's the world going with the evolution of the automated car, self-driving cars, AI, artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence. So these are all topics that are probably of interest to you. So feel free to enjoy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
self-driving car did that, would you trust it that it can drive? I'd be like, no, that's not enough for me to trust it. It's not for humans. We figured out that somebody being able to do that is representative of them being able to do a lot of other things. And so I think somehow for humans we figured out a representative test of what it means if you can do this, what you can really do. Of course, testing humans don't want to be tested at all times. Self-driving cars or robots can be tested more often, probably. You can have replicas that get tested and they're known to be identical to the same neural net and so forth. But still, I feel like we don't have these kind of unit tests or proper tests for robots, and I think there's something very interesting to be thought about there, especially as you update things. Your software improves, you have a better self-driving car suite, you update it. How do you know it's indeed more capable on everything than what you had before, that you didn't have any bad things creep into it? So I think that's a very interesting direction of research that there is no real solution yet. That somehow for humans we do. Okay, you have a driving test, you pass. You can go on the road now, and humans impact every like 1 million or 10 million miles, something pretty phenomenal compared to that short test that is being done.
So let me ask, mentioned that Andrew Ng, by example, shows you the value of kindness. Do you think the space of good policy for AI populated by policy that kindness or one or the opposite? People, if you just look at the policy we operate under as human beings, or if AI systems had to operate in this world, I think it's really easy to find policies that are full of kindness, like when actually fall into them, or is it like a very hard optimization problem?
I mean, there is kind of two optimizations happening for humans. But for humans, there's kind of the very long-term optimization evolution has done for us, and we're kind of predisposed to like certain things. That's in some sense what makes our learning easier, because we know things like pain, hunger, and thirst. And the fact that we know about those is not something that we were that's pain. When we're hungry, we're unhappy. When we're thirsty, we're unhappy. When we have pain, we're unhappy. And ultimately, evolution built that into us to think about those things. So I think there is a notion that it's somehow humans involved in general to prefer to get along in some ways, but at the same time also to be very territorial and kind of centric to their own tribe. Like it seems like that's the kind of space we converge down to. I mean, I'm not an expert in anthropology, but it seems like we're very kind of good within our own tribe, but need to be taught to be nice to other tribes.
Well, if you look at Steven Pinker, how that's better angels of our nature, where he talks about violence all the time. Whatever tension, whatever teams we pick, it seems that long arc of history goes towards getting along more and more. So,
I hope so.
do you think it's possible to teach RL-based robots kind of kindness, kind of ability to interact with humans, kind of policy? But let me ask one. Do you think it's possible to teach an RL-based robot to love a human and to inspire that human to love the robot? So to like a RL-based algorithm that leads to a marriage.
Interesting question. Maybe I'll answer it with another question, right? I mean, but I'll come back to it. So another question becomes, okay, I mean, how close does some people's happiness get from interacting with the really nice dog? I mean, dogs, you come home, that's what dogs do. They greet you. They're excited. It makes you happy when you come home to your dog. You're just like, okay, this is exciting. They're always happy when I'm here. If they don't greet you, maybe whatever, your partner took them on a trip or something, you might not be nearly as happy when you get home, right? And so it kind of it seems like the level of reasoning a dog has is pretty sophisticated, but then it's still not yet at the level of human reasoning. And so it seems like we don't even need to achieve human level reasoning to get like very strong affection.
humans. And so my thinking is, why not, right? Why couldn't, with an AI, couldn't we achieve the kind of level of affection that...
Or more of your time. Thank you so much for talking today.
Well, Mike, thanks for coming by. It's great to have you visit.
Following conversation with Jürgen, co-director of the Swiss AI Lab, co-created long short-term memory network. LSTMs are used in devices today, speech recognition, translation, much more. For 30 years, we proposed a lot of interesting out-of-the-box ideas, meta learning, networks, vision, even a formal theory of, quote, creativity, curiosity, fun. This conversation is part of the MIT course in Artificial General Intelligence and Artificial Intelligence podcast. Enjoy it, subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, simply connect with me on Twitter. Lex Friedman, R.I. Now, it's my conversation. Jürgen Schmidt. Early on, you dreamed of AI systems that help person. When was that dream born?
When I was I have nothing to... When I was a teenager.
And what was the catalyst, or what was the thing that inspired you?
When I was a boy, I think about what to do in my life. Exciting, riddle, not I'm a physicist. However, I realized that something rather build a machine that isn't really a machine longer, that learns to be much better physicist than I could ever hope. That's how I thought maybe multiply my tiny stuff change.
But ultimately, that creativity multiplied to understand the universe around us. That's the curiosity for that mystery.
Yes, and so if you can build a machine that learns to solve more and more complex problems, and more general problem solver, then you basically have solved all the problems, at least all the solvable.
So how do you think, what is the mechanism for that kind of general solver look like? Obviously, you don't quite yet have one or know how to build one, but have ideas. You have throughout your career several ideas about it. So how do you think about that mechanism?
So in the 80s, I thought about how to that learns to solve all these problems that I cannot solve myself. And I thought it is clear it has to be a machine that not only learns this problem and this problem, but it also has to learn to improve the learning algorithm. So it has to have learning algorithm representation that allows qualify so that it can come up with better learning algorithm. I call that better learning, learning to learn. It has self-improvement, this way of that, like not only learn to that problem way also improves the way it improves the way it improves. That was my 19 all about that. Hiring meta learners that no computational limits except for the well-known limits that Gödel identified in 1991 and for the limits of
Here's meta learning popularity in a form talked about. That's not really meta learning. Neural networks more transfer learning. You talk about the difference between the big general meta learning and more narrow
the example of a deep neural network that has classified, and maybe you have trained a network on 100 different databases of images. And now a new database comes along, and you quickly learn the new file. One simple way of doing that is to take a network which already knows 100 types of databases, and then you just and you train that using new data that you have in the database. And it turns out that really, really quickly can learn one shot. Because from the first 100 data sets, it already has learned so much about that it and that one was enough full capacity, a little bit investment on the top. So that is transfer, and it has been done in principle. True meta learning is about having learning algorithms that open to action by the system that is, and also open to modification, such that the line has an opportunity to define any part of the learning algorithm, evaluate the consequences of that modification, and then learn from that to create a better learning outcome. So that's a very different animal, where you are learning the space of possible learning algorithms, the learning system itself.
Right. If you, like in 2004 paper, you described Gale machine programs that we write them, right? Philosophically, paper mathematics really compelling idea, but practically, you see these self-referential programs successful in the near term impact where they're just demonstrate the flow, direction, the want to
Yeah, these different types of fundamental how to build a universal problem solver. One basically exploiting proof and things like that. They come up with this concept of problem solver. However, I have to admit that through this research comes in an additive concept, additive overhead that damages the person who what you have to do to solve large problems. However, for many of the small problems that we want to solve in our everyday life, we cannot ignore this constant overhead. That's what we also have been doing other things, non-universal things, neural networks, which are trained by creating locally sensitive and translate on and optimal but which are much more practical as long as we want to solve problems that we are typically trying to this so universal problem solvers like the good machine, but also the fast way of solving all possible problems which developed over thousands of years. They are associated with the constant overhead or guarantee the thing that you want. For example, the fastest way of solving problems with a solution, which is huge process stuff, and explain what's going on there, like Stirling-Simpson problem. Stirling-Simpson problem is and is try to find the shortest path to all these without any. And nobody we know is the constant way of moving, traveling, traveling, repeat. But let's assume there is a method of moving the five operations and number of things. Then universal method. I could going to solve the same problem constant into the times all one plus a constant number that you need of the proof structure, which you need to show that this particular constant problem, this Bayesian problem, can be solved within a certain into the lines that this as a constant careful as getting larger as you have more and more cities. The constant of parallel. That means almost all large the best way already today already have a universal carbon. However, it's not constant overhead. It's so large that all kinds of problems that you want to solve at this level.
By the way, when you say small, talking about things that fall within the they can seem quite large for us.
Right. So if it's large and are still small, almost all problems have almost all much larger than any constant.
Do you find it useful for the person who grades normal has worked on has done a lot of think about P versus MT, formalization of how hard problems are, how these, kind of worst case analysis, find that or is it only just mathematical, the mathematical outlook bad?
So, present, as you find that problem, also get inspiration for better graphic problem. On the other hand, we have to admit at the moment, graphic problem for all kinds of we are now solving what is called AI at the moment. They are not of the kind that find general purpose computers such as recurrent networks, but just notice search gradient to try to find a program that is running that network such that it can solve some interesting problem such as machine translation. And there is very little we find the best solution that we have at the moment.
Do you think that change, that will change? Can we go create a general intelligence system without ever really proving that it was intelligent in a mathematical way, solving machine translation perfectly, kind of situation language, or can we just be impressed working well? That's
There's an old saying, I don't know enough from which says there's nothing more practical than good good theory of problem unlimited this universe has to take into account so proud be that which is needed to what which tells us what we see in addition to that the practically of so I believe we'll have just a twist unnecessary technique and works better than any reading method, but that doesn't mean anything with that.
You said that an AGI system will ultimately be a general intelligence code. You talk through your like, why field for intelligence.
Experience tells us that the stuff that works best is really simple. So the basic attitude is also incredible. If you look at all the Nazis, just a panic, maybe don't, but they are also the most successful can write the lines out.
Beautiful idea. But you're describing there not just there's abstraction. These thing at the very top uh, algorithm. But do you think that there's many layers of abstraction person construct?
Or you have to all the great channels that ended over great training and basic characters, narration, derivative. So without our thinking about the others, couldn't do anything. So it makes sense that because John Ryan's past problems moving too much that now we have a chance to do the
Final step. Well, take a step back. So how do you think about evolution? What if creating a universe is required to achieve the final step? What if going through the very painful process of evolution, abstraction, ultimately, do you think there's a shortcut, or do you think we have to create something like our universe in order to create
not the only example
maybe a little better?
but yeah, part of the whole process. Apparently, hey, that code that's right, that possibility has the basic forces the law that can function. The code, the other, the can't be random, you have to memorize. No, moment, don't have the content code, but no, but you check to random generator with which computing regular and on that up and down going negative.
Underlying process. You ultimately a pseudo random. It's all determined randomness in our universe. Just gotta play dice.
A couple of years ago, the famous quantum I wrote on Nature. It started more or less like that. One of the fundamental
was that the universe fundamentally dependent on the whenever measure spin up or down or something like that, bits of information to you. While I was reading that, I was already predicting response, published it, because I was right. That there is no evidence, no physical evidence for that. So there's an alternative explanation where everything that's around us is actually super random, such as essence of part 141 and 1. It's interesting as every three sequence, every sequence of appears roughly 1 in 1,000 times. Every 5-digit sequence appears roughly 1 in. What do you if it was random? But there's a very short algorithm, a short program that computes on. So it's, I don't know, maybe tomorrow somebody grabs that goes back over all these data points, beta decay and whatever, and figures out, oh, it's 7 billion digits or something. We don't have any fundamental at the moment that this is true random and not just that video. Many of the basic laws of the universe, gravity and other basic very simple, very short programs, and they count the universe with ugly. But the extra thing, random, because why is that the time? Because I'm on extra bits of information. So as long as we don't have anything that no short program that computes times entire universe are compatible for the Jewish program backtrack. I will sure is that all the elements, all the plate 13.8. Yeah. Don't have it. That is that recipe. Beautiful. One works. But you also have a very, romantic notion, random, surprise, a thing body in our poetic reality require random. Don't find randomness determined. Yeah. Okay. Why? Why? Because the explanations show us that a short program is one again. That's one. Then another one, which needs an almost infinite bits. As we know, many things that are happening in this universe are really simple in terms of program, computer gravity, um, particles, and so on. All of that seems to be very simple. Every electron we use program all the time. And it is interacting with other elementary. If now require an extra oracle injecting bits of information all the time for extra things which are currently understood. such as data decay, then people select data that universe and therefore
And not there.
all yes,
Right. Destruction. What they depression. How do you see your signs that the humanity or on Earth kind of path depression? But
science is a history of compression program. What does that hundreds of years ago there was an astronomer and he looked at the data points that he got then the points and greatly compressed data by predicting an ellipse star. It turns out that all these data points are more or less around the sun. And another guy came along, it was they had the same thing that is making the atmosphere like that is what makes the atmosphere now. And it also holds for stones and for all kinds of other objects. Suddenly, many of these of these observations became much more compressive. Because as well, the next thing, given what you have seen so far, you can put that data extra. And there was still something wrong with that universe creation. And years later, another guy came. Actually, he came away all old which was called general theory of relativity, which at first glance a little bit more complicated. And phrase that one thing is no matter how fast you accelerate and how fast or hard you decelerate, no matter what is gravity or local network, light speed always looks from that you can calculate all the constants. That's very simple. And it allows you to further compress the observation. Suddenly there are hardly any deviations any longer that you can nothing. So out of science, compression program will never arrive immediately short explanation of the data, but you're making progress. After you are making progress, have an insight. Oh, I need so many different things to describe data. Describe my falling apple, video of falling apples, I need so many data, so many pixels, but then suddenly I realized there is a very simple way of predicting the third frame of the video from the first two. And every can be some orange blocks that are coming down, they accelerate in the same way, which means that I can greatly compress the amount of compression progress. That is not the insight at that moment. Fun. The fun at discovery. The artificial system do the same thing. They are looking at data which is coming in through their own environments and a reward, intrinsic reward, progression to the event they are trying the reward they get. They are suddenly motivated to
the traffic that is coming in as a consequence of experiments as the problem and lots of patterns which they hadn't seen yet before.
There's an idea of power play drive, training general problem solving kind of down south. Describe that idea further.
It's another very simple. So normally what you do in computer science, some guy gives you a problem and search potential solution candidates. Try them out, or get ways of moving around in that search space until you finally found a solution that's satisfactory. That's what most of computer science is about. Power play just goes one step further and says that's not only search for solutions to a given problem, but search to pairs of problems and solutions with itself opportunity. Raise so we are looking certainly at problems and modifications of the problem solver as opposed to generate a solution. And this additional freedom allows us to create like scientists in the sense that they not only try to find answers to questions, no, they are also free to pose their own questions. But if you want to build an artificial to give it that freedom, and power play is
that's the dimension of freedom that's important to have, but how hard is that? How multi-dimensional space of coming up with a question? As one of the things that is special is that brilliant light.
so now let's look at all problems that can formally define which the next problem that assigns power play is going to solve. Easy problem that goes beyond what you already know. Well, it should be the simplest problem that the current problem solver that you have, which can already solve 100 problems, that you cannot solve yet by just generalizing, but it has to require a modification of the problem such that new problem solver can solve this, but the old problem solver cannot. And that problem solver doesn't forget any of the. And so, by definition, power play is now trying to search in the pair of in the set of pairs of problems for combination and minimize the time. It's easy right here. Because always trying to find the problem to add to the repertoire.
Just like grad students and academics, research, and here in a local minima, stuck trying to come up with interesting questions. So I think it's easy to approach a solve a problem, get stuck in a local minima, not never discovering new, really jumping outside of creative.
No, because that's the nature of how that is always generalization. By coming up with a problem, beyond characterize shifting the horizon of knowledge a little bit out there, breaking saying I'm so capable, but it's all by you. So like adding it back
what Google did when it came up with sentences theorem that have a performance, which means that they want to damage the paper, the amazing title, Form of Creativity, Fun, Motivation. We talk about discovery. So if you intelligent agents, what do you think the person of life? Or if you talk about this discovery, right? Play.
Yeah. So humans are, and I mean, like scientists, not only the official scientists, but the baby science, playing around with their toys, figure out how the world works, how it's responding to actions, how they learn about gravity. 1990, we had the first system like that, try to play around with the environment and motivation that go beyond what they and that get a reward for creating systems and general problem solvers and being and more. So yeah, I think principle that that strategy, sophisticated versions of what I just described, they are built together. That's a good way of ignoring the guy who was the unknown world, higher chance of problems that he finds. And those guys who were too serious, they were weeded out as well. Evolution found it straight out. Apparently, now are certain methods extremely productive and it doesn't matter if they die because many of the others are conservative. And so yeah, it would be surprising to me if a principle of artificial intelligence wouldn't be present unless exactly.
So you're a bit of a musician and an artist. So continuing on this topic of creativity, what do you think is the role of intelligence? So you've kind of implied that it's essential for intelligence, problem solving, really solve problems. You have great.
Never have a program, sub-program that is called something. The side effect of what our problem solvers do, they are searching space of problems, or a space of candidates, until they hopefully find a solution for you. There are these two types of both of them one has output and the problem tries to a solution to that machine many decades machine has found bigger problem where humans were not aware of the data solutions, but then the second is pure creativity. As just mentioned, I would call the applied creativity, like applied art, where somebody tells you, I'll make a nice picture of, and you will get money for that. So, here's the artist, makes a convincing picture of the Pope, and the Pope likes it. And then there is pure creative, which is more like power play, and it is where you have freedom on problem. The scientist finds on question study. And so that is pure, if you will, and as opposed to the applied creativity terms.
And that distinction, there's almost like a narrow average, like kind of strange painting both like the approach is on narrow pure maybe I'm just biased special element of human level intelligence that we are buying.
If you back a little bit, just look at general problems machine, which is trying to solve arbitrary problems. Machine will figure out, of course, a big problem. So all of what I said about pre-wired curiosity and the will to get problems and doesn't know how to solve yet should be just a byproduct of the general. However, apparently, evolution has put it to us because it turned out to be so successful. Pre-wired, very successful exploratory bias that we have with.
Also, conscious problem solving. Do you find this interesting byproduct? Byproduct. What are your thoughts on consciousness? Or is it simply a byproduct?
I have a procedure called consciousness. However, yet as what these machines are doing, things that seem to be closely related to people consciousness. So, for example, in 1990, which were a bit because therefore trying to that data to then lead to I think more than is in the charging station with the battery is low and negative because of the battery always find the connection in time without bumping against paint very complicated but very motivated. And then we use little recurrent neural network just predict what's happening if I what will happen as a consequence of these actions that I'm executing, and it's just trained on the long and long activity of actions. Wow. It becomes the model of the wild thing. And therefore also a repressor. Because whatever you don't have to store external stuff. Compression decided prediction. And how does the neural network well, sending little programs, little networks that stand for everything that in the environment, like autos and microphones and maybe lots of things. My environments create something, a prototype, a new case comes along, and all I have are the conditions on the what's compressing and that's the secret. There's one thing that appears all the time and is present all the time when the agent is acting with the environment, which is agent. But as for data compression, it is natural for the network to come up with something stand for the properties of the agent, the actuators, all the stuff that you need and data, which is so there, side effect of data compression during kernel have kernel self model. Now you can use this and the future. And what we also have since 1990, neural network which is smaller, trying to maximize the power, this model of the network, this model network of the predicted model of the one, plan ahead and say, let's not do this action sequence instead, because it leads more reward. whenever it's subnetworks, it stands for itself. It's thinking about itself. It's thinking about itself and exploring eventually the consequences of its own actions. And now you tell me what is the
captive consciousness. There's idea that so life is a collection of data. Life is a process of compressing it efficiently. In that data, yourself appear very often form compression from the consciousness. Like described RNN developed LSTMs, long short-term memory, type of occurrence. I've got a lot of networks that model temporal aspects, temporal patterns, and we've called them deep of neural network. Value model learn.
long short-term memory and I have to of the brilliant
Of course.
first of all, my first ever step Hochreiter fundamentally already not even really explain or have contribution and explain Upland who was responsible for the CPC algorithm, which is now off train the Android phone, whatever. So, guys, without these guys, I would nothing.
A lot of incredible work.
What is the depth? What is the importance of depth? All you need to know about the instead have a memory of what happened in the past and important parts of that memory pretty old. So you're doing recognition, for example, as then that's about a second like that, which means it's going to be the guy or the same guy said so the ending but now the system has the distinction between 10 and 11 differences it has to store that 50 steps ago so there you have already a problem of depth 50 time step you have some virtual layer and whole version of the recurrent network which this week so the long time length to problem and most problem as such that you really have to look back in time to understand what is the problem and to solve it.
But just like with LSTM, you don't necessarily need to look back in time, remember every aspect of important.
That's right. Network has to learn put the important stuff in memory or the unimportant noise.
So, but in that sense, deeper is better, or is there a limitation? LSTM is one of the examples of architectures that beyond just doing deeper networks, clever mechanisms for getting. Do you think that kind of thinking is necessary? Think about LSTMs as the big leap forward over traditional RNN. What do you think next within this context? LSTM was a very clever improvement. LSTMs still don't have the kind of ability to form back as us humans. created a silent problem of feedback, not just time steps or 100 or 1,000, but million.
It's not granting and obviously looking already in 2000 and examples where it not only looked at thousands of steps but really millions and who um, find that what's the first author but you really examples where it learned to look back 10 million. So for most problems of speech recognition not necessarily that far back. But there are examples where it does. Now, but looking back, rather easy because there's only past. But there are many possible so a reinforcement learning trying to extend doesn't know yet which of the many possible features make concept. It's facing problems that the LSTM by itself cannot solve. But the LSTM is good for coming up with a compact of observations and actions so far. But now, how do you play among all the effectiveness actions? The reinforcement learning has to consider maximize reward in this unknown future. So again, we have the basic setup with binary count network, which gets in the video and whatever, and it's execution, trying to maximize reward. There is no future. Thousand wanted to at which point the network which just then that could be and it wants to look back all the way, make better what's the next time step. So essentially, although it's next it is motivated to memories of million steps ago, to memorize that if now how one of them are like predicted used by the first guy controller the model. How can the model controller select the password? The naive way we had about 30 years ago was let's just use model as a simulation of the world and by milliseconds plan the future and that means we have to pull it out. You know, the black only model is really good and it will because we all the future and so instead what we do now to now control the model systems control actually entire right all more quickly and it wants to it can learn to ignore but it's a good idea to ignore the end because it's really bad after and particular patient of where the controllers can't be trying to maximize reward. However, it can also learn to exploit programs that came about the model network through data by predicting. So it now has an opportunity to use that code, algorithmic information, model network, to use home search that it can solve and determine quickly without the regression. So you're also optimistic about the power of our real concept. Do you see RL actual having a huge impact, not just art,
little Audi. It's learned to the same where I use that for us. So these are Audi, they are all the little Audi. They have all the sensors that you find in the real Audis, cameras. They go up to 100 an hour, and they are main sensors basically, and they put the sound signals of and so as long maybe used to pack and interactions that lead to successful which is morning they learn that. Wave of going to be all about that. Different wave of passive pattern observation, prediction, what you have on your platform, happens on grammar you marketing. That's the current source of profit. It's only 1 or 2% of the economy, which is big enough to make these companies pretty much the most valuable companies in the world. The much bigger fraction of the economy going to be affected by the next wave. It's really about machine shape through their own actions.
Do you think simulation ultimately the biggest way that those methods that's what I'm talking about near term or required other where do you
So at the moment, I have a simulation that run to columns and also how to however, this is not the future. They don't with the future. They learn. They could, maybe sometimes it's wrong, but it captures all kinds of high level predictions are really important to and that's what was a years ago. But still, now we know much better how to go there to move forward and really make working where you have learning all of the world that runs through. To have an and that, then controller that model to more quickly learn successful action. And then of course always this curiosity thing at the beginning the model is stupid, also the controller should be motivated to come up with experiments sequences that lead to data that improve the model.
Do you think improving the model, constructing the world action now the popular approaches that's was grounded that work. But in the 80s, that's symbolic AI approach, which humans are more intuitive sense that the field of knowledge and knowledge representation. What kind of let's start our current approach?
I became aware of all of that at 18 back then, and logic programming was a thing.
Inspiring to yourself, finding it compelling. Most a lot of your work was not so much.
No, but we did all of it. Was a of a genetic product. That's what you learn back, which is a logic programming language.
recent AI project was mostly about logic programming. So, networks are well known. Learning has existed 1995 in the brain. But Japanese and many other people, they focus really on this logic programming. I was influenced to the extent that I said, okay, logic program and implement that in the language and program. Ways that came back like that as virtual machine, for example, search on how that the for Microsoft as universal algorithm for solving all well-defined as a group search on board. That's very much logic programming. Now that is backing up. But then on the other hand, as we have logic focused on recurrent networks and suboptimal stuff such as gradient search and program space, proof of optimal
Logic programming as a must try to construct something optimal is a useful for problem.
Logic programs, and they are much better feature improvers than most math students in the first or second semester.
But for reasoning, playing games like Go or chess, robots, machines that operate in the real world or object manipulation, you think learning.
Yeah, as long as the problems have little to do with theory proving themselves, then as long as that's not the case, you just want to have better pattern recognition. So to build a self-driving car, you want to have better pattern recognition, recognition, and all these things. You want to minimize the number of positives, which is completely slowing down self-driving in many ways. And all of that has very little to do with logic programming.
What are you most excited about in terms of direction at this moment? Your own research.
So I think in the not so distant future, we'll have for the first time little robots that learn like humans. And I will be able to say to the robot, look here, robot, we are going to assemble a slab. Let's take the slab of and the screwdriver and let's screw in the screw like that. No, not like that. Not like that, like that. And at the data deliver something. And he can me and he will try to do something. Actuate which will learn to targets all this. No, by doing this high level imitation where he first has to learn to create these additional powers. Because it's helpful to that better. Then it's myself. What would faster way, more efficient ways thing. And finally I start his learning algorithm and really can't be that. So at the moment, but you already see how we are going to imagine to the extent that this works economics cheaply, it's going to change everything. Almost all a much bigger way, AI way than the one that we're currently talking about. classic tradition affected all the counted machines. Well, it could be these machines with cameras and other sensors, and they are going to learn all kinds of problems. Through interaction with humans, a lot of their own, but they're very, and lots of old economy is going to, I've seen that old economy is actually waking up. Very optimistic about that term nature is have are optimistic that further into the future people Elon Musk about their near term job loss, long term uh that's the we have had prediction of job loss of many decades, for example, being lost, many people some jobs lost. And so they were right. Back then there were car factories, hundreds of factories assembled cars, same car factories, hundreds of robots and maybe three guys watching. On the other hand, those countries that have lots of robots per capita, Korea, Germany, they have unemployment. Somehow, all kinds of jobs. Back then, nobody this is job. And years ago, I already said it's really to see which jobs are going to last, but it's really hard to predict. Years ago, but jobs predicted all these people don't make money as all agriculture. Today, maybe 1%. Still, only 5% of the jobs were created. Is inventing jobs all the time are not essentially necessary for the survival of a species. There are only very few essentially necessary jobs, farming, building houses, warming up the houses, but less than population. Most of newly interacting with other people in new ways, and getting new likes, whatever, making money from that. So, Homo ludens, the playing man, doesn't want to be unemployed and jobs all the time. And considering these jobs as really important, a lot of energy was a job.
but nervous about the future because you can't or ultimately the human rest of jobs like get left or whatever. So what about long term just out of AI or most of them swallowed up by ultra super intelligence?
Maybe it's not going to be swallowed up, but I'd be surprised if we were
were the last step in the evolution of the universe.
You've actually will comment somewhere that I've seen saying that artificial, quite insightful, artificial intelligence, I think that's human, like they don't want to interact, they'll just interact amongst themselves. Ants interact amongst themselves and only tangentially interact. And it's quite an interesting idea that once we create AGI, that will interest humans have speak for their own Facebook likes on their own platforms. So within that idea, how do we know, hypothetical sense, there's not already intelligence there? How do you think broadly, general intelligence, how would we know it's out there? How would we know it's around us?
I'd be surprised if within the next few decades or something like that, won't have the eyes that and problem solving every single way. And I'd be surprised if they realize what we have realized a long time ago, which is that almost all physics is on the spice, but further out the rest of the solar system gets 2 billion solar energy that lots of material out there, robots, replicate robot factories and all this stuff. Curious, they will explore what they can do. And in the beginning, they will be fascinated by life and by their own origin and our civilization. They will want to understand that completely, just like people today would like to understand how life works. Also, free of our own existence, civilization, physical laws that created all of that. So they, in the beginning, they would be fascinated by life. Once they understand it, they interest, like anybody who is interested in things makes sense. And then, as you said, the most interesting source of information then will be others of their own kind. So, at least in the long run, there seems to be some sort of protection through lack of interest on the other side. And now it's clear, as far as we understand, matter and energy to compute more robots and structure and more AI civilization, AI ecologies, and trillions of different AIs. Well, that is not going to AI ecology by one AI, trillions of types of competing and all kinds of evolving and disappearing ecological ways that we cannot track at the moment. But it's going to expand, limited by light. It's going to expand, and now we realize that the universe is still 13.8 billion years old. It's going to be 1,000 times older than that. So there's plenty of time to conquer the entire universe and to use it with intelligence. And sensors and receivers, such as AIs, can travel the way they are traveling in our labs today, which is by radio from Jerusalem. And let's call the current age of the universe 1 year. 1 year. Now it will take just years. The entire universe is going to be. Let's look ahead to a time when the universe is going to be 1,000 times older than now.
they will look back and they will say, almost,
Well, how do we know it's not among us? How do we know planets aren't in themselves intelligent beings? How do we know ants are our own kind of ideas?
when I was a boy, I was thinking about it. And I thought, maybe it has already happened. Back then, I knew, I heard after books that the structure, the large scale structure of the universe is not homogeneous. And you have the pieces of galaxies, and these empty spaces. And I thought, maybe the algorithm that in the middle of that, some isolated technology has expanded and then has covered a bubble of a billion light years diameter, all the of all the stars within that bubble, and practices. So it always happened. We just fail to interpret in a lot. Gravity by itself claims the large scale structure. And this is not a convincing explanation. Then I thought maybe it's the dark matter because as we know, of measurable matter. Know that because otherwise our galaxy or other galaxies would fall apart, rotating too quickly. Was all of the isolations that are already out there, they are just as they efficient. Not that almost that's appear dark to us. Awesome. Especially because then the question becomes why are there still stars living in all galaxies, which also must have a lot of dark matter. So that is also not a convincing. And today, I like to say quite plausible that the stars are faster than our local light cone within 200 millions of light years that we can reliably
Exciting. Might be the first.
and would make us much more important because if it's done to a nuclear war, then maybe this will have an effect on the development of the entire universe.
Let's not mess it up.
Not mess it up.
Thank you so much.